Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bayuk, a partner and worker owner at Lyft Economy. My guest today is Kat Taylor. Kat Taylor works in service of restoring social justice and environmental well-being to build a more equitable and inclusive world. As many Next Economy Now listeners know, Kat is co-founder of Beneficial State Bank, a CDFI who is working to bring beneficial banking to low-income communities and be a model to change the banking system for impact. Kat is also a co-founder of Radicle Impact Partners, a venture fund for early-stage enterprises working on climate solutions and fair finance, taking a unique or rare systems change approach that we'll hear more about. Kat is also founding director of TomKat Ranch Educational Foundation, which is inspiring change in the food system through a number of efforts, modeling best practices, research, science, training, and working with schools on nutrition and garden programs. Kat also serves and has served on many nonprofit boards, including EcoTrust, Good Samaritan Family Resource Center, the Community Development Bankers Association, and the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, amongst others. Kat, welcome back to Next Economy Now.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's nice to be here. This is a great opportunity, and I love the work of Lyft Economy and this podcast too.
Thank you so much. Well, I would love to turn it over to you to hear kind of what's the listeners probably heard on the last time you were on the show, a little bit about your kind of life journey and story, but what's alive for you now? What's going on in your life that's informing your work and what you're excited about?
Well, short song to say, I'm still doing this work for the same reason. Here we go. They say that these are not the best of times, but they're the only times I'll ever know. And I believe there is a time for meditation in cathedrals of our own. So when I see that sad surrender in my brother's eyes, I can't stand aside and only sympathize. For we are always what our situation hands us. It's either sadness or euphoria. So I'm going for euphoria. And I would say what's new since the last time we spoke is that we're baking a cake of many layers. So my partner, Tom Steyer, and I have tried a lot of things, and they're cumulative. We don't stop trying one thing to start trying something else by way of intervention or business model or strategy. So we initially did what I would call conventional philanthropy. It's very important to treat the symptoms of poorly designed systems, but it's not enough. So we wanted to go into systems change work, and we decided we'd pick three giant overlapping systems: good food, good money, good energy, and design and build organizations that were actual actors in those systems to get the insights of what it was like to act amongst them. So that's why we started Beneficial State Bank and the venture fund Radicle Impact Partners, at the heart of the financial system that we knew there was something terribly wrong in, which has been validated time and again, 2008 financial crisis, the most recent banking crisis, et cetera. And then at the heart of good food, we established TomKat Ranch, which is a learning laboratory to de-risk and broadcast regenerative agriculture. And it does a lot of work off-site as well in policy and legislation in collaboration with the Office of Kat Taylor. At the heart of good energy, Tom deduced very early on that our climate trouble was coming from a political problem, not from a scientific or a business problem. Well, business problem too, but we know what to do in science and in business to curb climate change and achieve the other benefits we know are possible when we do address the climate problem. And he started doing a lot more policy and legislation work. So he started Next Gen Policy, which we're still very, very involved in, which is Arnie Sowell's organization attending to policy and legislative rulemaking and rule reform in the state of California as a microcosm for the rest of the country as well, across many, many issue areas. We started looking at philanthropic reform because our philanthropic assets and grant making have not been successful in the main. To date, we have ever more and, cascading giant global existential problems. So how can we align philanthropic assets with purpose and make sure that the money is going out the door? And then coming Then Tom ran for president to get climate and race in the presidential conversation, which was something he could afford to do as a long shot candidate and make sure that it was, robustly considered as we choose our national leadership. Coming off the campaign where we'd heard from, thousands of Americans, basically, we realized the importance of storytelling, which is what actually changes hearts and minds. And we resurrected an accidental film company and rebranded and professionalized it into TomKat Media, uplifting the unheard voices of those communities heard the first, worst, and longest, who have the best insights into where we could go and a bigger, more inclusive solution set. So I probably missed something, but we're just trying a lot of things. Oh, platform cooperatives, and we can talk about that later. And it's all in the spirit of being part of creating space for our economy to be rebuilt on the basis of stakeholder capitalism and our civilization to be rebuilt on network effects where we recognize that we all do better together than we can apart. So that's kind of where I am right now.
That's a great update. I heard a few things in there that really resonated. One was this kind of move from addressing symptoms and trying things on and learning there to a systems perspective. And that's something that shows up across your work now. And even in the way you describe the impact of your work, like at Radicle. Recently, you published a kind of retrospective of the portfolio, I believe, of Fund 1 and Fund 2 and the impact of Radicle Impact. Is there anything you want to say about what's going on with Radicle Impact and that systems focus? Anything about the portfolio you're really excited about, or anything to look forward to in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do always have a broader mission on all the organizations to change the system for good. And Radicle's mission at the meta level is to change venture for good. And that's really important because in the year 2022, we saw both the zenith and the nadir of venture returns for a 10-year period. In 1 year, it was like something like 35% return and then negative 18, and these have real repercussions because that's one of the primary ways we allocate capital for investing in our future. It also, is part of the basis of the $68 billion deficit that California is facing this coming year. So it's important to get the capital flows right. And so we wanted to create a venture model that turned a lot of the presumptions of venture on its head. So for instance, we do not invest in 20 companies knowing or allowing 19 of them to fail because one's going to be, a super home run hit. We provide additionality to all our portfolio companies to make sure they are as successful as they can be. We don't let them go. We do not seek the highest return possible, which to me always comes from either or all three of underpaying your colleagues, overcharging your customers, and throwing your garbage over the fence. We are looking for attractive returns with holistic systems change impact. We prioritize founders and companies founded by and representing racial and gender equity and diversity. I think 75% of our portfolio companies are founded or run by people of color or women. And Radicle Impact itself is primarily run by people of color and women. I think it's 75%. Anyway, then on the impact, we're looking for transformative impact that changes at the systems level from an extractive system to one that's regenerative and inclusive and provides prosperity and equity for everybody and tends our planet, which is what we depend upon in the main. We report our mission metrics and impact. We do that in affiliation with a firm called Bluemark, in whom we actually have an investment as well, advancing the field building for impact measurement and reporting. It's coming at a trepidatious time because we have both a lot of imposturing in the venture and private equity markets about what impact is, promising something and not delivering it, or promising something that's a false solution, or just not measuring accurately and honestly. So we need to be a part of advancing the field of impact measurement and understanding what transformative impact is. I'm actually, through TomKat Foundation, investing in an impact investing gaming platform with Eli Media and Ford Foundation, so we can iterate solutions very rapidly and frugally and see how they work. We have very little time before terminal events of either climate chaos or massive social injustice that destabilize the planet. So we can't afford to have long experiments that cost a lot of money and divert resources from something else. We need to figure out, is this going to work and will it matter? The Radicle, in seeking attractive returns, also recognizes the return profile of portfolio companies that are delivering regenerative impact. It isn't a rapid, overnight unicorn.
Yeah.
We have to invest over time because there's a number of things that have to mature in an impact-driven company. A lot of times they are in longer sales cycles, like they're selling to municipalities or they're selling to OEMs or whatever. So it takes a while for things to come to fruition. A lot of times they have to mature both the methodology of mission delivery and the measurement of it. So we're patient investors. We need capital to be patient. But ultimately, our goal at Radicle Impact is to migrate $1 billion of capital toward this kind of venture model and improve the lives of 100 million people. So as you mentioned, we've now raised 3 funds. Fund 1 and Fund 2 had as LPs only Tom and I, or our private foundation. But Fund 3 has attracted 11 outside investors, which is a really positive. That's what we're measuring too, is the migration of so-called conventional capital to this new model of venture. Fund 3 is closing at the end of the year, but we will raise money in 2025 and keep trying to change capital allocation towards stakeholder capitalism and things that are fully inclusive, just, and steward the planet. Beneficial State Bank has a similar theory of change, which we can talk about if you want to, but I just want to say that's how we're approaching our theory of change and systems change in the financial markets, which, by the way, we have to get finance right or we won't get anything else right. It is so massive an industry and so influential. It's got huge leverage in it. I think when the 2022 GDP was $23 trillion, something like that, that's a revenue number. The assets in the top 10 energy companies worldwide was $10 trillion. That's an asset number, but assets generate earnings. The financial system had $123 trillion of assets in the United States alone. And if you add shadow banking, it pulls in another $60 trillion of assets. If we don't get those assets working for us while they're now working against us, we won't be able to change any other industries either.
Yeah. And so even if some of the change is incremental and symptoms as it had been, but then looking at a systemic change is kind of the shift. And I think it's actually a really good indicator that Fund 3 has brought in new limited partners as a good signal that the types of returns and even the patient thesis and the approach that Radicle is taking is starting to be accessible to other people in the field, and that's going to potentially ripple out and influence, other fund development, ultimately maybe changing the norms from what we expect from market rate returns and the timeframes for IRRs to yield. Let's talk about banking, though. I'd love to hear what's going on with Beneficial, because there's another talk about assets and transformation, like you said, in finance, a huge leverage and an enormous problem today. But Beneficial is taking a systemic approach to try and transform banking as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the progress there and what you're excited about what's going on?
Sure. And just a cautionary note on the impact investing side in venture, because I think something like $30 billion has been raised by so-called climate venture funds. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a handful of tiny funds and 5 giant ones. So it's very concentrated. And personally, I don't think we're going to come around right until we rid ourselves of these concentrated, consolidated systems, industries that tend towards corruption. That's true of banking too. We have 5 money center banks that are all over 2 trillion in assets, well over at this point. And they don't finance the Main Street economy, which you alerted me to early in our, partnership. By and large, the Main Street economy is financed by regional and community banks. And if you look at this most recent bank turmoil with the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic and so on, that created a flight to subsidy, not to safety, to subsidy, because everybody knows those big banks now are once again too big to fail. They have systemic risk. They will not be allowed to fail. But when our deposits flee to that that means they're leaving the Main Street economy where they can actually do good and produce the world we want to live in. So I think of banking as the original and most powerful form of crowdfunding. Not that it's single deposit finance is a single loan, but all deposits fund a lending practice. And that's the most important thing we should be focused on.
Yeah.
Is it important that banks deliver fair, transparent banking products? Yes, absolutely. And we constrain ourselves to only fair, inclusive banking products. But it's also the lending practice that enjoys the leverage of a bank. The fractional reserve system is more complicated than this, but just to simplify it, for every $1 of equity that we have, we can lend $10 because we can couple it with $9 of deposit. That's about. So many things happening at the bank. We are a mission-driven bank. We are triple bottom line. We must deliver environmental well-being and racial and social justice at the same time. We're financially sustainable. We want to create an attractive business model that is appealing to other business actors to adopt. So we care about profit, but we constrain our profit. So we have an ROE, return on equity target of 6 to 10%. You won't find another bank that has an upper limit, but that's where we think we can live and attract outside capital, but not be underpaying our colleagues, overcharging our customers, or throwing our garbage over the fence. We are a B corporation. We are a community development financial institution. We adhere to all these outside measurement regimes to make sure that we're showing up honest and committed to our mission. And we're trying to change the banking system for good, as I mentioned. It's not good enough to be a good bank in a bad system. So the bank has a unique ownership structure. Its economic rights are all held by nonprofit organizations, primarily Beneficial State Foundation. Until recently, we did a lot of PPP lending, the Paycheck Protection Program lending, which was so smart to put money in the pocket of workers who could not work so they could continue to pay their rent, buy groceries, etc. I think it actually saved us from an economic recession. Like, that was just a smart thing to do. But we also did it right. The $300 million of PPP lending that we did was 25% to organizations founded by women or minorities, 33% to nonprofits, 95% to organizations with 20 or fewer employees. It was exactly what Treasury recruited the capital from Congress, the allocation, and put it out there to do. It's like, that's what we were trying to do. So as a reward for that, Treasury also received $12 billion from Congress to recapitalize the CDFI banking system and reward us for doing the work that we're designed to do. So we received $218 million of capital investment from the Treasury, making it the largest investor in the bank at this point. Very patient, very low cost capital, competitively awarded on the basis of impact. So we had to prove impact in the past, and we had to warrant and promise impact in the future. It's going to allow us to expand and scale our existing business lines that include things like a high road auto loan, a lot of affordable housing lending, a lot of environmental lending in the solar space and other regenerative practices of business, all these really good business lines that we currently have. And it will allow us to expand into other influential activities, things like maybe a B Corp advisory or a business insurance that helps other businesses align for their mission purpose. So that's all really good news. We have to still be fashion forward on the impact measurement and metrics front, because there's even more imposturing going on in the banking sector. Banks, pointing to the shiny, bright object, the one thing they did good, and diverting your view from all the harm that they're doing. We often say to the big banks, if you just stop the harm, we'll be so far ahead in this game. We don't need you to do the nice, New York Times article or headline thing. So it will also allow us to scale, to improve and prove the business model is replicable. And the business model depends on alignment of 6 activities. Beneficial State Foundation, which owns a lot of the economic rights of the bank, recently published the ethical banking standards to try to crowdsource a new discipline for banking. Banking is already a quasi-public activity because we give it FDIC and tech insurance, which is backed by the American taxpayer. And we already ask banking to do a lot of non-financial performance indicators as part of the regulatory process. So we surely have to be safe and sound from a financial perspective because we are safeguarding depositors' money. But we also have to meet fair lending and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and we have to thwart cyber fraud, and we have to, protect financial information. So we're just suggesting to regulators that we should be regulated for more positive social activities and environmental activities, and regulated to stop doing the harmful activities.
Yeah.
So that's one way we hope to change the banking system. The other is to attract consumers to a better banking model that's aligned with their values. Don't let your money sleep overnight in a bank that's financing private prisons, fossil fuels, and extractive finance. It's just not good for you. And there are good alternatives that are viable and competitive and attractive. And then industry relations, we call it, trying to prove that this is the best way to make a buck as a bank. Come over to this side. Your returns will be more resilient. Your stakeholders will be more diverse and therefore more resilient in panics and scares in the banking system. There's not one reason why people bank with us at Beneficial State Bank. There's probably 1,000. At Silicon Valley Bank, there was one reason people banked there, because they were startups financed by the venture community, and their venture funders said, you will bank there. So when Peter Thiel said everybody out of the bank, they moved in lockstep. So there's many advantages to a beneficial banking model. And the ethical banking standards pertain to how are you governed?
Mm-hmm.
What is your lending and investing activity, and how is it aligned? Do your products and services make a person better the day after they took it than they were the day before? Is their mission at the heart of those? How are your other corporate practices? What's your carbon, landfill, water footprint? How do you treat your employees? Do you pay them a living wage? We pay actually over a living wage. We pay people to live, not just to work. What's your policies on transparency? What do you report on? Don't hide anything. And then advocacy. We never advocate in our self-interest. Our advocacy has to be like, we were very instrumental in reorganizing the Department of Business Oversight in California, which is probably one of the largest regulators of financial institutions, into the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, because consumer protection has to be warranted in the banking system. It's otherwise can be such an extractive system that it basically crashes households and communities. And we've seen that historically, and it's still going on today. So change the system for good, have a concrete theory of change, ever grow the field building for impact measurement and reporting, because otherwise we can't warrant stakeholder capitalism. And that's the only thing that's going to allow us to survive and thrive.
This is great news about the Treasury coming in as an investor and what this is going to enable in terms of the amplification of existing services and new opportunities. In terms of influencing the field, have you seen any other banks that have taken, maybe who are following the ethical standards and maybe starting to embed stakeholder capitalism into their governance or into their structures? Is there any inspiration out there that's kind of following the lead of Beneficial that you're tracking?
Yeah, and I would say we're very lucky in the company we keep, and it is a cohort that's advancing the field. And they include other trade associations. So we're members of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. Those are international banks that adhere to very strict standards on mission, both racial and social justice and climate, environment, all those things. They have advanced the field a lot, and some of their banks are very big and scaled, like GLS Bank in Germany, Triodos Bank in the Netherlands, and Brac Bank in Bangladesh. So proving that you can actually be a larger institution and still meet these commitments. And then we are, as I mentioned, a B corporation. I think there's something like 5,000 B Corps now, something like that.
6,000 maybe? Yeah.
6,000, yeah. And God bless Ryan Honeyman, because he was the last person I got to talk to on this show. And he's helped really advance the B Corp field. But I think there might be 8 B Corporation banks now, which is very exciting, because that's a very comprehensive review of your practices and mission commitments. The CDFI sector, I think there's like 170 banks and maybe 700 loan funds that meet the Community Development Financial Institution commitment, which is essentially 60% of your lending landing in low to moderate income communities. So reverse redlining, if you will. And I'm trying to think, the UN principles, we're signatories on that. So I would say there's been a proliferation of impact regimes to which more and more actors are complying. And even our ethical banking standards is part of an effort to, now that there's been this flourishing of standards, how can we rationalize them and make sure they're the most comprehensive, most authentic, drive out impostering, all that kind of stuff, and maybe be a little more apples to apples because everybody's meeting some, or maybe one or two common standards. But even the ethical banking standards, which are pretty strict, they're great. They're spectrum.
I
So
see.
like minimum commitment, emerging leader, and then leadership on, sort of standards. And I think there's now 25 banks who have signed on to, experiment in this space and try them on for size and see how they measure up and things like that. And even one or two might be divisions of one of the money center
Some of the
banks that
large
we're
ones.
just
Okay.
dissing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's progress. That's, the field doesn't change overnight. And so these incremental steps add up over time. Thinking about systems change and big assets, what about, we talked about finance and financial assets, but probably the biggest asset in the economy, even though we don't think about it that way, is land and how we
Yeah.
treat land. And when I think about some of your work, I think about the work you've done around regenerative agriculture, both with the foundation and in work with communities directly. Is there something that you could update us on, like what's going on with your efforts there? And that might be working with communities or platform co-ops dealing with the food system. You tell me, what are the things that you're tracking that are
Yeah.
interesting?
Yeah. So yes, I would say land and soil is, our most important earning asset, and it needs to be stewarded in common. But we've grown very far away from that and have an industrial system that's not only very punishing to almost everybody in the value chain, except, the chemical companies, the agribusiness, vertically integrated groups, and the commodities trading firms that deal in food futures and stuff. So that industrial system is not only consolidated, concentrated, and it's very corrupt. And it's highly subsidized. It's not a natural outgrowth of, free market economy. It's an artificial food system. And what we're arguing for is really a back to future strategy, because a regenerative approach to food production, fiber production, everything we're looking for from agriculture is really just a return to the traditional foodways of the longest standing people, the people who lived 45,000 years, not 5,000 years, under those systems. And they, the practice may be modernized and may be more technology enabled, but to me, it's a recognition that the only fair, resilient, reliable food production system, or food and fiber and everything else, is wilderness based. It's a recognition that we have to be in balance with nature, because nature gives us the only alchemy we really have: photosynthesis and the biodiversity to support healthy living soils. Industrial ag tends to look at soils as a vessel that stuff is pulled out of and then you fill it back up, not as a living system of, I think 4 out of 5 organisms on the globe are nematodes in the little microbes that are, mining the soil for minerals and nutrients and exchanging those with the plant for carbon. That's how the carbon gets in the ground. So this is also a recognition. This is coming out of COP, which is kind of a sham COP this year. But anyway, as somebody, I think Greenpeace said, why would you have gun manufacturers run a peace convention? But we kind of did that. We had oil and gas running COP. But anyway, recognition, finally, this is decades in the making, that agriculture may be the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases if you look at scope 3, all the way through the value chain. But it's also our biggest carbon sink, and it's ever expanding. So if we can eliminate the emissions from agriculture and start putting carbon back into soil where it can do no harm, where it belongs, that's taking it out of the atmosphere and keeping it from getting in the oceans. And it's resequestering carbon, because we won't get there by emissions reduction alone. Oh. And the reason it's ever expanding is when you allow carbon through photosynthesis and the microbial community to go back in as durable carbon in the soil, it creates more topsoil, which is then after that able to absorb more carbon. So it's not a fixed bathtub. It keeps growing as you go. And the estimates of ancestral carbon in soils, pre-Anthropocene, I think is 11%. That soils were 11% comprised of carbon. They're now 0.5 to 1%. And the delta is what's causing us the problem in other places where it doesn't belong. This also is an important time in history, because we're talking about impact measurement. And right now, I'm just going on the record. We are investing way too much money and expecting too much from carbon capture and storage. and carbon dioxide recovery. It's billions of dollars now going into that. It is antithetical to nature to vilify an element. Carbon is one of the 4 elements we look for to find life on other planets. It is desperately needed in the soils. We will not be doing something smart to stuff it into limestone caves or capture it to make industrial fertilizer that further kills the soils and allows carbon to go back in the air. So the question is, what do we do about this? So the ranch has 3 verticals. The first is to de-risk, broadcast, and scale regenerative practice in agriculture. And we do that we have Point Blue Conservation Science, previously Point Reyes Bird Observatory, a long-standing ecological monitoring organization with massive data sets and scientists and everything. So they're on site ecologically monitoring with us, but also recruiting other land managers to come in to regenerative practice through the Rangeland Monitoring Network and to track a common data set now, I think for 12 or 13 years, because we have to undergird the scientific case for regenerative agriculture and the business case. And the research agenda that's been driven by industrial ag never asks the right questions. So we're behind on R&D to support what we know is going to work and produce a lot of co-benefits. So we also need to remind people that these systems are not single vector or single impact metric systems. They produce co-benefits, and we need them all at this time. Certainly we need the carbon sequestration, but we also need water quality and storage. We need biodiversity above and below the ground. We need economic resiliency in our rural communities who safeguard our commons. We need a healthy food that doesn't put someone on a lifelong trajectory of disease that's really expensive to solve. We need equity in farm labor and farm succession. We need land access, to make sure that we're stewarding all the lands in this practice. So you mentioned land. TomKat Ranch Educational Foundation does the de-risking broadcasting. It also has what's called fork to farm. We have to build the end markets because every producer sells first and plants second. So we have to create big buyer demand strategies that will allow the supply chain to shift in favor of regenerative practice, which means more economic and environmental justice as well. Our biggest strategy in that is school food. So we were just very involved in a coalition of 208 organizations representing not just food, ag, and education, but also labor, healthcare, climate, economy, environmentalism, to pass permanent funding for universal free breakfast and lunch for all 6 million school children in California. That is a huge lever in the supply chain. It has to be healthy food, but it's starting to be guardrailed to be locally produced, freshly prepared, minimum added sugars, fat, and sodium, those sorts of things. That will be a very big signal to our food economy in California.
Huge lever.
Yeah. And we have to couple that with supply chain supports, because that's on the demand side. There is a silver bullet. It could be coupled with other public procurement regimes, the so-called MUSHPAs, municipalities, universities, schools, prisons, and hospitals. But California has a big budget. And if we help that shift the supply by those procurement regimes, that's great. And it will lead others to follow. On the supply side, though, we have to pull a lot of levers. So we're very involved in land back and ag finance and crop insurance and, all the things that are needed to support a regenerative system that hitherto were put in place to support an industrial one. And hopefully we'll migrate some industrial producers to regenerative ag, or just simply take the business and the political support away from a system that's really harmful. The third thing that the ranch does is gather for action. And there's extraordinary leadership in the country right now around a shift towards regenerative ag. We have Zach Ducheneau, a tribal leader, 5th generation rancher running Farm Service Agency, which previously was one of the most discriminatory land thieving agency in the American government. And now he's instilling a new paradigm for ag lending that's much more around investment on the time frame of healthy soils and land stewardship. We have Speaker Rivas, just the brand new speaker in California, Robert Rivas, who's a regenerative advocate, and he previously chaired the ag committee, so he had a lot of the relationships and allies to get something done in California. And California is where industrial ag came from. We exported it to the Midwest, and it was based on a lot of other crazy things like the two-tiered labor system in California came from originally a really good thing, the Braceros program, where Mexico lent us a lot of ag workers during the war, and we turned it into, an oppressive labor system. So if we get California right, there's some hope that the rest of the country could follow suit. So anyway, they reconvene all sorts of groups of out-of-state legislators. Speaker Rivas came with a delegation. Aspen Institute came with their climate funders to get them to think about ag investing. We had NRCS and RCD, the two main technical assistance agencies in the farm system of the United States, come about training on regenerative practice and so on. So it's really important that we get people gathering for action is really important right now. So those are kind of the main thrusts of TomKat Educational Foundation. But I mentioned to you before the Agricultural Platform Collective, which is an outgrowth of a program we ran during the pandemic called Growing the Table, that was farm support and emergency food aid. So we raised $3.5 million of philanthropic capital to pay largely BIPOC small producers of regenerative product, fresh produce, essentially, pay them a fair farm gate price, and then distribute that food for free in the communities, most of which they came from, the low-income communities that they wanted to support. And we gained a lot of insights about the precarities of the industrial system and the opportunity points for a regenerative one to infiltrate and take hold. So the afterlife of Growing the Table is this APC, the Agricultural Platform Collective. It's based on an economic principle called platform cooperatives, not to be confused with purchasing, selling, equipment sharing cooperatives in the ag space, but rather platform cooperatives are potentially all around us right now because we have a network effect style industries where a network effect, which is the value of the membership goes up with every member that joins, tend towards monopolies and oligopolies because it doesn't make sense to have two of them.
Harder to start something new when everybody else is involved in the other thing.
Exactly. And it's Google and Facebook and Amazon and Netflix. They're going to be with us because we have global computing power and global connectivity. I don't think we're going to get rid of them. The bigger issue is how they're owned, managed, and controlled. Totally. And so right now, they're owned, managed, and controlled by the capital providers who do add value to the platform. They have to build the competitive infrastructure, and that's not easy to do. So if TikTok comes out, they got to build reels, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not the majority of the value on the platform. The majority comes from the users, the members. And it happens not just because of their data. It's when they share, shop, query, create content, connect, et cetera. That's the real value in the network effect. It's called social production, but they're not compensating for it. So you can imagine, and it's starting to happen a little bit, that like YouTube is starting to give royalties to their most prolific content creators. It's smart for them to do that. But the more interesting thing would be to give micro shares of equity to proliferate the ownership and therefore the control and management of the platform to democratize it. And you could say like, well, who's going to do that? Like, they're not going to give up equity for what they're getting free now, except that proliferating the ownership and having more people have skin in the game protects the network effect because they can reverse. MySpace went away in a couple of weeks or something. So if the membership starts to defect, it increases the defection and then you can lose the whole thing. So if everybody has a stake in it, they're constantly improving it, they're adding value, they're getting paid, they're getting equity, they're less inclined to leave, and they also protect it. Like a more proliferated ownership of Facebook, as long as you get governance right, which is not easy, but probably wouldn't have let Cambridge Analytica on there. They'd say, no, we don't want that in here. Anyway, so we're working on that on small scale with a design committee and a steering committee and farmers charrettes to design a small agricultural platform cooperative. We're calling it a collective to not seem like we're competing with cooperatives or confusing with them. And we're launching a pilot that's basically a product offering, like recruiting producers to join the collective because they're going to get a livelihood necessary benefit from it and keep expanding what those benefits are and grow the concentric circles of benefit to maybe it's only farmers and ranchers and what they need right now in their main business, but eventually it's healthcare insurance at a fair price, mortgage lending, advocacy for state and federal policy change. And just see if we can grow these little platform cooperatives and then unite them in a federated but still decentralized and autonomous network of platform cooperatives, a little bit like the DAOs are trying to do, as a new economic model in stakeholder capitalism that will solve for the corruption that comes from consolidation.
Totally. And it leverages the reality of network effects and the fact that it's a balance of federated. So there's a connective tissue, there's an alliance, there's a sharing, there's a collaboration, but there's autonomy and kind of place-based, culture-based kind of characteristic expression that enables diversity. So you have the balance of diversity, but still connectivity. And that's how ultimately we have to replace what you name it, whatever the Walmart, the Facebook, or any of the large kind of corporate business as usual kind of build by accretion, oversized multinational corporations. An economy that's going to serve life needs to be this federated, networked scale of this replicable pattern. So we need those models. And it's exciting to hear about the Ag Platform Collective because we need that in ag. We also need it in housing. There's so many areas of the economy where we need these models that respect the needs of those members who are stakeholders. In this case, it would be the communities in the land and the places that we live in. Super important. I'd love to hear more. Next time we check back in, I'm going to be tracking this Ag Platform Collective because I want to know more about this first pilot product and how it's working.
Thank you, Kevin, for just those great insights, because I get a little nervous and then I monologue and you're talking. I go like, oh my God, I forgot I need to listen to Kevin because he's got a lot of smart ideas about a new economy. So
happy to share. So we've covered some of this, systems focus in some of the major domains that have always been your passion. The same reasons you were in it from your life journey are the same reasons you're in it today. And we've talked about Radicle, we've talked about Beneficial, we've talked about the foundation. I'm curious what else you're tracking that is, alive in you, that's important. Is there anything else that you would want to share with Next Economy Now listeners that we might not know about or that you're excited about? Curious what else is there.
Mm-hmm. So I would say we got involved in philanthropy reform because philanthropic assets are growing at like a historic rapid pace, especially donor advised funds. And donor advised funds, the least is required of them. I mean, they're very easy to set up. They're 3 times tax savings. So they're no income tax, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax. That's foregone government tax proceeds. That's not free. There's some estimates that 72 cents of every dollar put into a donor advised fund actually comes from the taxpayer. So that's how much is shielded. So if we're going to have these, we thought we need some reform to say they got to go out the door at some point as actual grants, because you can create a DAP and never distribute anything from it. They can be dynastic. You can keep them. They are kinetic energy power. They have influence. The hosts, you have to park a DAP at a host and you no longer own it, but you make recommendations about
they're going to listen to the donor, whoever's hosting it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are. And the incentives are bad because the hosts also want to keep the assets because they're managing them and getting fees. So, we were proposing modest reforms, like you have to give it away in 15 years. You get the tax advantage in the instant it's created. So you have to give them away in 15 years, or you don't get some of the tax benefit until you give it away. So thinking about all that made me think about, okay, but we're kind of looking at the tail, not the dog, because even the 5% rule of private foundation, that you have to give away 5% of your assets, of the earnings of your asset, but that isn't going to change how those assets are invested. So if
they're invested at 20% and you have to give away 5%, well, okay, what's happening with that asset base?
And if they're invested in fossil fuels, private prisons, and extractive finance, your 5% isn't going to come close to cleaning up that mess. And it's business outcomes that drive societal outcomes more than government or philanthropy even. So why would we not attend to how we invest our philanthropic assets, that they be for mission purpose? So we're a long way from that being required. But there are financial intermediaries that are doing a great job, like Impact Assets, has been advocating for this for a long time. That is their value proposition. We'll help you invest your assets for purpose, not just your grant making. So I thought Tom and I give money away on demand. Like, we never let assets sit around pretty much that I can recall in our history. We just give the money away as fast as it's contributed to any vehicle. But then I started thinking, oh no, but we need to be a model for impact investing of philanthropic assets. So we created this pledge called the Good Life Pledge to give a third of our assets away during our lifetime to other control that is also not individual. So to land trusts or community trusts or things like that. But in the meantime, I mean, we are doing some of that. We're also trying to change the ownership structure of those institutions where our philanthropy assets lie. So the Beneficial State Foundation, which holds the bank stock, TomKat Ranch Educational Foundation, Office of Kat Taylor, OK Think, Next Gen Policy are all, I believe Next Gen Policy, are all in the process of becoming public charities, which have to be democratically governed forever. They can't be owned, by an individual at all. And they're a better way to proliferate ownership of assets, because we don't want to just reconcentrate them in some other person's hands. We want them to be owned in community, sort of thing. And then on the impact investing side, we're just making a lot more investments. They would have been grants before. We just turned them into PRIs or MRIs in particularly media projects like the gaming platform I mentioned before, a documentary that we're financing with Ford Foundation as well, but also in financial intermediaries that are productizing impact investing and recruiting DAFs into that, like impact assets. And then we haven't made that investment yet, but we're going to. And then in intermediaries that can do a better job of investing in like ag producers. For me to invest directly into ag producers, that's a one-off due diligence every time. It doesn't scale. For me to invest in pot liquor capital or mad ag or grounded, who have the distribution system, who do the diligence, who are on the ground, that's a more leveraged way to use my financial assets and turn them into aligned impact investments. So trying to model both those kinds of behaviors. The media company, I think, is going to do some really interesting work lifting up the narratives of unheard voices. We are very focused on witches or soothsayers or whatever term you want to use, those individuals who see around the corners and warn us of danger and give us an idea of what we can do about it. That's Harriet Tubman, Rachel Carson, Erin Brockovich, Martin Luther King. They're like, how can we lift up those heroes? Everybody's running a little scared of AI, understandably, but we're really working hard to figure out the beneficial uses of AI. And I think in storytelling, it's going to be a game changer. So we're trying to experiment and model a little bit there. My colleague, Marcella Davis and Aviles, who I'm so lucky to work with at TomKat Media, has a career in the entertainment business and storytelling. She's a journalist as well. She's pivoted the tentpole concept, and I didn't even know what this was. I'm a naive in this area, but the tentpole concept is when the studios make a feature production like Coco that Marcella actually worked on. The conventional tentpole is Coco, the picture is the tentpole, and the spokes around it are other assets and activities that produce even more return. So they're the lunch boxes and
merchandise
merchandise. They're the game or the cartoon or like things like that. So Marcella said, let's pivot it. Instead of sucking the cash out of the communities, let's give them more assets to work with, interest them in a social justice or environmental issue by the narrative, and make it really entertaining, suspenseful, Hitchcockian, whatever it needs to be to get the issue out on the table, and then create podcast episodes or activation campaigns or renewed journalism or toolkits for community action, and give open source those free to all the communities. So if they want to take action and solve this problem, they have a lot of assets, and we haven't drained their cash out by selling them,
Right. The next
a lunchbox.
Yeah. But they could still be affiliated with that compelling narrative, but in a way where they can leverage that affiliation, that excitement into action and collective action for benefit for themselves and their community.
Yeah.
Love it. Yeah. That is a nice pivot on the tentpole model. Very exciting. So philanthropic reform, a number of different aspects to that, as well as doing more stuff in media and trying to rein in some of the risks around AI and seeing if there's positive benefit use in that kind of media landscape. The storytelling, something you mentioned earlier, being so important there to change the hearts and minds to stimulate the action that we need to take as a society and as a people. Those are great insights into what you're tracking, and no surprise, it's not a short list of activities. Is there anything else that you would want Next Economy Now listeners to know?
Well, I should mention that my magnificent partner, Tom Steyer, is trying to redirect capital flows to what we need as well. So he's raised over $1 billion on a platform called Galvanize that's going to eventually cover all asset classes, policy, and scientific research, investing that capital into climate solutions. So I think that's going to be really important to change capital flows at scale. I work more in the lemonade stand categories, trying to be point of the spear and catalytic. Somebody's got to mess around out there experimenting, but we also have to, pay attention to the law of large numbers, that we don't have a lot of time to turn these capital to good.
Yeah, well put. Thanks for mentioning that. This is all very helpful and a good update from the last time that you've been on the show. So much to share that's going on in your work and in your life. And we're really grateful that you're, courageously pursuing. These are hard questions, hard things to solve. And it takes, the grounded motivation and then some perseverance, because none of it's easy. And being the tip of the spear, even it's $1 billion lemonade stand and not multi-billion or whatever it is, these are things that actually change people's lives and impact the possibility for a livable future. So thank you. Thank you for being on the show. Thanks for all the great work you're doing.
May I say one last thing? Because
Sure,
I've been really paying attention to narrative and paradigm. And I think we can get in this scary place of a mindset of scarcity and fear and things like that, where we literally are dismantling and cost cutting and limiting. And when what we need to do is exactly the opposite. Like, cities are having a hard time right now. That's an opportunity to reimagine what a city is. Is it, the best place to live and work because it's walkable and it's equitable, and it's how we meet our 3.5 million unit gap of housing in California? And shouldn't we be investing more, not less? What is, in the year of a big deficit, how do we recharge the California economy so we don't have a big deficit? And it's a mindset shift. It's eschewing the naysayers and pushing for more life, not less. And I said this the other day at an environmental conference, and I thought I was going to be thrown out. But, we're used to saying that we're going to have 9 billion people, and that's a liability, and we'll never, be able to, that's past the carrying capacity of the planet. And it's like 9 billion heads are better than one. Come on. The problem is consumption, less the units of living beings. And I don't know, I think somebody's doing this analysis, but for instance, when trillions of animals were living in balance on this planet before we had any influence as a puny primate, I wonder if there was more life than there will be with 9 billion people in terms of energy or calories or however you want to measure life. It just was cycling in a healthy metabolic way. That's what we have to get back to is, life is good. Let's have more of it.
I think it's our friend Tom Chi who compares like the mass of humanity. If you take all 9 billion humans and you compare it to the mass, I believe he compares it to ants. And he's like, we actually have an equivalent mass on Earth. One species is detrimental to a potential for a livable future and life and carrying capacity. The other is going about its business and aerating soil and, defoliating foliage that regrows and being, our impact on our ecosystem is something where we absolutely could be regenerative. And I agree with you. I don't think we've scratched the surface. I think all I have to do is look at this horrific landscape of militarism and trillions of dollars being invested in militarism and defense every year. And, through my work at Drawdown and other projects, I know if we redirect those resources to living and what humanity need, we barely scratch the surface about what's possible for the fecundity and abundance that's imminent. It's just the other side of the coin.
Yeah. We need to be a helpful species.
Totally. Planet positive. Thank you, Kat. Really appreciate you. Thanks for making time. And
my pleasure. Thank you.
Hopefully we can have you back on the show after another bit of time and we can get some updates on all this amazing work you're doing.
Thank you very much. You're very kind, and it was a great chance to catch up too. Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.